The page she tore out was wet when I found it. Not with rain, not with river water. It smelled like iron and wood rot, and the bottom corner carried 4 long indentations where something with claws had pressed through the paper hard enough to nearly puncture it. She had hidden that page beneath a loose floorboard under the firewood stove in her cabin. 20 years of research stacked neatly in binders across her shelves, and only one missing page in the entire collection. Just one. That was the page she could not let the government archive. That was the page she died trying to keep hidden. I know because I was there the night she burned the rest. The thing people get wrong about creatures like this is the scale. Every drawing online makes them too large, too monstrous. They imagine something towering over trees like a movie monster. That is not what walks out there. The real thing is worse because it fits into the world almost naturally. 7 feet tall at most when upright, lean enough to disappear between spruce trunks, built like something meant to run for days without tiring. The first time I saw one move through snowfall, I remember thinking it looked less like a wolf and more like a starving man pretending to be one. You clicked on this because of the word Dogman. I understand that. Hell, maybe I would too. The internet turned the whole thing into campfire garbage years ago. Fake sightings, edited photographs, drunk hunters yelling into podcasts. But Dr. Evelyn Mercer spent 2 decades studying them quietly across the Montana backcountry, and by the time she tore that page from her report, she was terrified of what she had learned. Terrified enough to ask me to bury her before dawn if things went wrong. Looking back, that should have been the moment I walked away. But loneliness makes people protect dangerous things. Sometimes because they fear them. Sometimes because they love them. I think Evelyn stopped knowing the difference years before I met her. The wind that night carried the smell of pine pitch and wet ash through the valley. I remember that clearly because her cabin windows were open despite the cold. Smoke drifted out into the dark woods behind the property while papers curled black inside the stove. Hundreds of pages, maps, photographs, veterinary diagrams, handwritten notes in blue ink. Gone. And Evelyn kept staring at the tree line while they burned. Not at me. Never at me. At the woods. Like she expected something to come out and stop her. I had known her for nearly 11 years by then. Long enough to recognize when her hands shook. Long enough to know she only drank bourbon during storms or after sightings. That night, she drank half the bottle before midnight. "You ever hear a wolf mimic another wolf?" she asked me. Her voice sounded thin, worn down. I told her yes. She nodded once. Now, imagine something learning people the same way. That was the first real mistake. Not hers. Mine. I should have left right then. Packed my truck and driven south until sunrise. Instead, I stayed because by then I cared about her too much to leave her alone with whatever haunted those mountains. The torn page came later. But to explain why it mattered, I need to explain Evelyn herself. The rain started 3 days after the fire. Hard spring rain. Cold enough to sting your face. I drove back up to the cabin with supplies because Evelyn had stopped answering the satellite phone. The road into the Bitterroot Range was half mud by then. Fallen branches everywhere. I remember hearing coyotes somewhere west of the ravine while I unloaded diesel cans from the truck bed. No lights inside the cabin. That bothered me immediately. Evelyn hated darkness. Said the woods became too loud after sunset when the generator died. I called her name once from the porch. Nothing answered except the rain hammering the metal roof. Inside smelled wrong, wet fur and cold ashes. Her research binders were gone from the shelves. Every single one except a thin gray folder sitting open beside the stove. Empty except for torn binding threads where a page had once been removed carefully by hand. not ripped, extracted. I found blood near the back door, small droplets, already drying, and beside them, tracks. People online always describe Dogman tracks incorrectly. They imagine giant wolf prints. That is not what you find. The front half resembles a canine. The rear pad stretches too long, too narrow, almost human at the heel, like evolution changed direction halfway through building the thing. These tracks circled the cabin twice, then stopped directly beneath Evelyn's bedroom window. I called for her again. Still nothing. The forest beyond the porch looked almost black beneath the storm clouds. Dense lodgepole pine swaying in the wind. Visibility maybe 30 yards at most. Yet I had the distinct feeling something stood just beyond sight watching the cabin. Not hunting, waiting. There is a difference. You feel it in your spine. I drew my rifle from the truck then, old military habit, safety off, barrel low. And that was when I heard her voice. Not outside. Under the cabin. Dale. Weak. Barely audible. The storm muffled everything else. I found the cellar hatch beneath the kitchen rug, locked from inside. She opened it slowly after I knocked twice. I can still picture her face emerging from that darkness. Mud on her cheek, gray hair hanging loose, eyes bloodshot from exhaustion, and fear. Real fear. Not because she thought someone might kill her, because she believed something already had. She climbed out holding that missing page in both hands like scripture. I was wrong, she whispered. Then she looked past me toward the woods and locked the cabin door immediately. I met Evelyn Mercer 12 years earlier during a government cougar survey near the Idaho border. I was 64 then. Retired Army. Living alone out of a fishing cabin after my second marriage collapsed under the weight of too many funerals and too much silence. She arrived at the ranger station wearing soaked hiking boots and carrying enough field equipment to invade a country. The first thing I noticed was the scar across her left wrist. The second thing was how she watched the forest instead of people. Wildlife biologists usually loved talking, especially the academic types. Evelyn did not. She observed conversations the same way hunters observe tree lines, quietly, measuring gaps. That week we crossed paths twice near the ridge cameras. The third meeting happened at dusk beside Miller Creek, where she caught me examining strange tracks near the riverbank. She froze the moment she saw them. Not surprised, afraid. "You photographed those?" she asked. I said no. Good. That single word carried more emotion than anything else she said all week. Later, she invited me to her research cabin 30 miles north of the survey area, said she needed help repairing fencing before snowfall arrived. Truth was, she wanted someone she could trust. Someone isolated enough not to run screaming to newspapers. I understand now how carefully she selected people. Divorced men, veterans, fire lookouts, wilderness workers with no families nearby, people already detached from normal life. Easier to silence, easier to trust. The cabin sat in a narrow valley surrounded by timber so dense the sunlight reached the porch maybe 4 hours daily during winter. There were motion sensors mounted in trees long before I arrived. Trail cameras hidden beneath moss. Livestock fencing reinforced with steel cable instead of wire. At first, I assumed bears. Then I saw the feeding pit. 3 elk carcasses laid out in precise rows 50 yards beyond the tree line. Bones stripped almost surgically clean, not torn apart randomly. Harvested. Evelyn noticed me staring. "They prefer fresh liver first," she said quietly, like we were discussing weather. I laughed because I genuinely thought she was joking. She did not laugh back. That night she finally told me the truth, or enough truth to keep me there. 20 years earlier, she had been part of a classified predator migration study funded jointly through Fish and Wildlife Services and a private ecological research group. Officially, they tracked wolf reintroduction effects. Unofficially, they investigated reports from tribal land near the Canadian border involving unidentified pack predators. Not cryptids, not myths, unknown animals. At least, that is how the project began. Then, one of the graduate researchers disappeared during a winter survey, then another. No bodies recovered. Only shredded thermal gear and blood trails ending abruptly in deep snow. Most teams quit after that. Evelyn stayed, because she saw one. And once she saw it, normal life stopped making sense to her anymore. The first evidence Evelyn ever showed me was not a photograph. It was a tooth. She kept it wrapped inside an oilcloth pouch above the cabin sink, beside dried sage bundles and rusted fishing lures. Yellowed at the root, curved slightly inward, too broad for wolf dentition, too narrow for bear. She placed it in my palm one cold October morning while sleet tapped against the windows. "Look at the wear pattern," she said. I remember turning it beneath the lantern light. The edge was flattened in places like something that chewed bone constantly. Not scavenging, processing. "Where'd you get it?" I asked. She stared toward the woods before answering. It left it behind, not found, not recovered, left. That wording mattered to her. Outside, the valley smelled like wet cedar and frozen mud. Snowmelt ran down the trench beside the porch in thin gray streams. Evelyn moved around the cabin quietly while coffee boiled on the stove. Every few seconds, she glanced toward the motion sensor monitor mounted beside the table. Nothing on the screen except static tree silhouettes. Still, she kept checking. Looking back, I realized she had already spent years living like prey. At first, she only shared fragments of the research project. She never dumped information all at once, almost like she feared speaking too much might make the thing real again. I learned details slowly over months, repairing fences, hauling diesel, and helping maintain her camera grid through the Bitterroot backcountry. The original study began in 1991 after a series of livestock disappearances near reservation land north of Glacier National Park. Official reports blamed wolves. Local ranchers disagreed. Not because animals vanished. Predators do that every winter. What disturbed people was the condition of what remained. Half-buried carcasses. Ribs opened carefully. Organs removed with precision. And tracks that changed shape mid-stride. Evelyn showed me casts from those early sites one evening during heavy snowfall. The plaster impressions filled an entire shelf beneath her desk. Some resembled oversized canine prints. Others looked disturbingly human. "Same animal," she said. I remember laughing uneasily. No animal changes feet halfway through walking. It does if it shifts posture. That sentence stayed with me. The cabin heater rattled while wind scraped branches against the roof. Evelyn spread photographs across the table between us. Blurred thermal images. Tree damage 7 feet high. Deer carcasses hanging from branches. Then one photograph she almost pulled back before I could study it. Yellow eyes reflecting flashlight glare from behind pine trunks. Too level, too aware. I asked if that was the first one she saw. "No," she said softly. "That one watched me for 3 nights after Thomas disappeared. Thomas Avery, graduate student, 26 years old, missing since February 19th, 1994. Evelyn never called him dead, only missing. Even after 20 years, that should tell you something." Over time, she revealed the project's central conclusion. The creatures were not random wanderers. They followed migration corridors through the mountains with frightening consistency. Elk routes, river valleys, old mining roads, like they understood geography in a strategic way. And there were always two. Always. One larger, territorial, aggressive, the other curious. That pattern repeated across every documented encounter. Evelyn eventually named them herself during the years she monitored the Bitterroot pair, Romulus and Remus. She admitted the names sounded dramatic, but she said watching them interact reminded her of old stories about brothers raised outside civilization. Romulus was the larger male, thick shoulders, torn right ear. Rarely approached the cabin directly. Remus was leaner. Younger, perhaps. Gray around the muzzle. He watched from distance instead of hiding completely. He likes music, Evelyn told me once. I thought she was joking again. Then she played an old Johnny Cash cassette while we repaired equipment near dusk. An hour later, we found fresh tracks circling the porch. That was the first moment I truly felt the shape of her life. The isolation. The impossible routines built around impossible neighbors. She was not simply studying them anymore. She had adapted herself to them. The strange part is how ordinary it all became. You spend enough weeks hauling feed barrels into a hidden valley while discussing apex predators over canned soup. Eventually, your brain accepts almost anything. Humans normalize terror faster than people realize, especially lonely humans. By November, I was staying at the cabin several nights weekly. Snow packed deep around the property. The woods carried sound strangely during winter. Every snapped branch echoed forever. That was when I heard the crying. Not wolf howls, not coyotes. Crying. High-pitched and uneven, almost human. Coming from somewhere uphill beyond the eastern ridge. I reached for my rifle immediately. Evelyn grabbed my arm before I could stand. "Don't answer it," she whispered. The sound came again. Closer this time, like a child sobbing through broken lungs. Every hair on my arms lifted. Evelyn muted the lantern until the cabin sat in near darkness. Only firelight moved across the walls. I remember seeing genuine panic in her expression for the first time. "Thomas answered it," she said quietly. Outside, the crying stopped abruptly. Then silence. Heavy silence. Deliberate silence. Not because the forest was empty, because something had gone still listening to us. We stayed awake until dawn. The next morning, fresh tracks surrounded the cabin. 2 sets, one large, one smaller, both ending directly beneath Evelyn's bedroom window. She photographed every print before sunlight reached them, methodical, calm again, like fear only existed at night. That afternoon, she finally showed me the hidden room beneath the cabin. Concrete walls, backup generator, medical supplies, locked filing cabinets. Enough canned food for months. It looked less like a research shelter and more like a bunker. "You built all this for animals?" I asked. Evelyn hesitated. "No," she answered. "I built it after they learned my name." I wish I could tell you I left after hearing that. I did not, because by then curiosity had its hooks in me too, and because part of me believed Evelyn Mercer was simply damaged by too many years alone in the wilderness. Intelligent people can convince themselves of extraordinary things when grief mixes with obsession. I told myself that repeatedly during those early months. Then December came, and I saw Remus standing beside the frozen creek at sunset. Not clearly, not fully, but enough. Gray fur soaked dark with snowmelt. Long arms hanging too low against its sides. Eyes fixed directly on the cabin porch where Evelyn stood holding a lantern. The creature never threatened us. Never growled. It simply watched Evelyn with the recognition of something familiar. Then it turned and disappeared between the trees without sound. No crashing brush, no snapping branches. Just gone. Evelyn looked strangely relieved afterward. "He's alone tonight," she murmured. I asked where the other one was. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she stared toward the ridge where the creature vanished. Then she said something that still wakes me up some nights. Learning us. The snow reached the porch railings by January. Thick powder blown sideways by mountain wind, until the entire valley looked buried beneath white ash. Those winters in the Bitterroots carried a kind of silence that made every sound feel important. A branch cracking half a mile away could stop a conversation cold. Evelyn liked that silence, said it made patterns easier to hear. By then, I had started helping maintain her camera traps full-time. 37 units spread across 12 square miles of forest. Motion-activated, infrared-modified, mounted high enough to avoid curious bears. Every third morning, we snowmobiled between sites replacing batteries and memory cards. Most footage showed nothing unusual. Elk herds, lynx, coyotes fighting over carcasses. Then, every few weeks we caught fragments. A shoulder moving behind trees. Eyeshine too high above the ground. Frames corrupted by static exactly as something entered view. Evelyn cataloged everything obsessively. Temperature, wind direction, moon phase, estimated travel speed. She treated the creatures less like monsters and more like undocumented predators occupying a stable ecological niche. That was what made her dangerous to the agencies funding her. She wanted recognition for them. Official recognition, not extermination. One afternoon we reviewed footage from a northern ridge camera while sleet hammered the roof. The clip lasted only 8 seconds. A mule deer crossing frozen brushland at dusk. Then, suddenly, freezing mid-stride. Every instinct in the animal changed at once. Its ears flattened. Head tilted toward the tree line, and then it bolted. Half a second later, something crossed the background. Too fast to fully register, but unmistakably upright. Evelyn paused the frame repeatedly. There, she whispered. The shape stood partially obscured behind spruce trunks. Long forearms, narrow torso. Head angled slightly downward like a wolf scenting snow. What makes you sure it isn't a person? I asked. She zoomed further. The hind leg bent wrong, not backward. That internet nonsense always irritated her. Real canines do not have backward knees. What disturbed Evelyn was the gait. The proportions shifted depending on movement. Quadrupedal during acceleration. Upright during observation. Efficient either way. Nothing natural transitions like that, she said. Outside, something hit the side of the cabin hard enough to rattle the windows. Both of us froze instantly. Another impact followed from the rear wall. Not claws, not an attack, more like warning knocks. 3 strikes. Then silence. Evelyn muted the monitor screens immediately. "Don't move," she whispered. Her voice had changed, calm but tight. I reached slowly for the rifle leaning beside the table. The cabin suddenly felt very small around us. Firelight flickered across the walls while sleet hissed outside. Then came the breathing. Wet, heavy, directly beyond the kitchen wall. You could hear lung congestion in it, deep chest vibrations. Not growling, just breathing. The thing stood there for almost a minute, then walked away. No rush, no panic, just slow crunching footsteps circling toward the backwoods. I realized then what terrified Evelyn most. Not violence, intelligence. Predators attack, animals flee. But these things observed, tested, learned boundaries. Every encounter felt deliberate. That night, Evelyn finally admitted the truth about why she tore herself away from academia and buried her research out there. The project had continued unofficially after the disappearances. Private funding, quiet partnerships, retired wildlife personnel. A handful of biologists convinced the species represented something scientifically revolutionary. Then came the Idaho incident. February 3, 1998. A survey team established bait stations near abandoned logging routes east of Salmon River. 4 researchers. Satellite communications active. Armed escorts nearby. At 2:13 in the morning, the radio operator transmitted one final message. They're copying us. Nothing afterward except static. Search crews recovered the camp 30 hours later. No bodies, no blood. Only tracks circling the tents and audio equipment ripped apart piece by piece. One recorder remained intact. Evelyn played it for me exactly once. I wish she had not. The first minute contained ordinary camp noise. Wind, zippers, someone laughing quietly, then distant howling somewhere beyond the ridge. Except it was wrong. Not wolf vocalization, too uneven. The sound shifted halfway through into something almost human, trying desperately to imitate a wolf. Then came a voice, a man's voice. Help me, weak, frightened. One of the researchers inside the tent answered immediately. You hear that? Another voice replied. That's Nolan. Except Nolan was sitting beside him when he said it. The recording ended 30 seconds later with screaming and gunfire. I remember sitting motionless after the tape stopped. Evelyn stared at the dead recorder in her hands. They don't mimic sounds, she said quietly. They mimic responses. That sentence hollowed something inside me, because suddenly every strange interaction made sense in the worst possible way. The crying outside the cabin, the knocking, the circling patterns. Not random behavior, experimentation. A week later, I met Remus properly for the first time. The temperature had climbed enough to soften the snowpack. Meltwater dripped steadily from the cabin roof while fog rolled low through the trees. Evelyn had gone south for supplies, leaving me alone to repair fencing near the eastern tree line before dark. I remember hearing ravens first. 3 of them circling above the ridge, making enough noise to draw attention uphill. Then silence again. I kept working another 10 minutes before realizing the woods had gone completely still. No birds, no wind. That unnatural silence Evelyn always talked about. When I looked up, Remus stood maybe 40 yards away between 2 spruce trunks, watching me. He looked smaller than I expected. Lean. Gray fur streaked dark from melted snow, arms hanging almost to the knees. The head resembled a wolf structurally, but the eyes ruined the illusion immediately. Too focused, too aware, like looking at a person pretending badly not to be one. I should have run. Instead, I froze, holding a fence hammer halfway raised. Remus tilted his head slowly, curious, not aggressive. Then he stepped forward once into clearer view. I noticed the object immediately, my red winter glove hanging from his mouth. The left one I lost 3 days earlier near the creek. He dropped it deliberately at the fence line. Gift behavior. Evelyn had mentioned that pattern before. Small objects left near the property, shed antlers, dead rabbits. Once an unopened canteen taken from an abandoned campsite miles away. I picked up the glove carefully without taking my eyes off him. Appreciate it, I muttered. God help me, I actually said that. Remus blinked slowly, then vanished back into the timber almost silently. Not because he moved impossibly fast, because his body blended into the woods with terrifying efficiency. That evening, Evelyn listened quietly while I described the encounter. Instead of fear, I saw sadness cross her face. He trusts too easily, she murmured. I asked what that meant. She stared into the fire a long time before answering. Romulus doesn't. The first time I saw Romulus clearly, the valley smelled like thawed earth and blood. Spring arrived late that year. Snow still clung to the northern slopes while the lower trails turned to knee-deep mud. Meltwater rushed through the ravines hard enough to shake loose entire trees. Evelyn always grew tense during the thaw season, said movement increased once the passes opened. Migration season, feeding season, watching season. By April, I had settled into her routines almost completely. Morning equipment checks, afternoon trail maintenance, nighttime logging sessions beside the stove while wind rattled the cabin walls. Strange how quickly human beings adapt to impossible circumstances when repetition gets involved. Even fear becomes domestic eventually, especially when nothing attacks you. That was the illusion Evelyn lived inside for 20 years. The cabin carried signs of the creatures everywhere once you learned how to notice them. Scratch marks 7 feet high near the woodpile. Bones left deliberately beside the creek crossing. Small gifts arranged outside the porch after storms. Always from Remus. Never Romulus. Remus brought things with curiosity, feathers, rusted tools. Once an entire fishing creel stolen from somewhere miles away. Romulus left warnings. Deep claw gouges cut into trees surrounding the valley perimeter. Deer carcasses displayed openly along trails. Territory markers. Boundaries. Evelyn respected those boundaries religiously. Never walked north of the shale ridge after sunset. Never entered the eastern ravine during mating season. Never followed vocalizations into dense fog. Always. Always. That was her rule. Then, one rainy afternoon, she broke it. We found the elk at dusk near the upper creek bed. Fresh kill. Rib cage opened cleanly. Steam still rising from the organs in the cold air. Ravens circled overhead, screaming at us from nearby branches. Evelyn crouched beside the carcass silently. "Too fresh," I muttered. She nodded once, then pointed toward the mud. Tracks, 2 sets, one enormous, one lighter, both leading uphill into dense timber. "We leave," I said immediately. But Evelyn kept studying the ground. That obsession in her had grown stronger lately. Less caution, more fixation. Like 20 years of unanswered questions were wearing holes through her judgment. Then she noticed something near the carcass. A strip of fabric tangled beneath the elk's hind leg. Dark blue. Human-made. She picked it up slowly. Uniform material. There were old fire lookout towers scattered through those mountains. Most abandoned decades earlier. A few still used seasonally by forestry crews. Evelyn stared at the torn fabric long enough for dread to settle into my stomach. "Someone's up here," I said. "No," she whispered. Someone was. The rain intensified around us. Cold drops hammering branches overhead, while fog rolled between the trees. Visibility shrank quickly. Then came the whistle. 3 short bursts somewhere uphill. Human. I saw Evelyn's entire body tense instantly. Another whistle answered farther away, then another. Moving through the woods, not random, coordinated. I remember gripping the rifle tighter. "Search team?" I asked. Evelyn shook her head slowly. "No one uses that signal anymore." The whistles stopped. Silence returned so suddenly it felt staged. Then we heard footsteps approaching downhill through brush. Heavy, deliberate. I raised the rifle immediately toward the sound, and Romulus stepped into view. Every description online fails because they exaggerate the wrong details. The horror was not size. Romulus stood perhaps 7 feet upright. Massive, yes, but still within reality. What destroyed me was the posture, the confidence. He moved like something fully aware of being the dominant presence in any environment. Dark fur matted with rain, broad shoulders rolling beneath muscles scarred from old injuries, one torn ear hanging ragged against the skull, Eyes pale amber even in fading light. Human eyes can fake anger. Animal eyes cannot fake patience. Romulus looked at us patiently. Then his gaze shifted toward the fabric strip in Evelyn's hand. I swear to God the creature recognized it. Not curiosity, recognition. Evelyn slowly lowered herself to one knee. "Easy," she whispered, not to me, to him. Looking back now, I understand how warped the relationship had become. She no longer viewed them as wildlife. Somewhere over those 20 years she crossed an invisible line into coexistence. Maybe even attachment. Romulus stepped closer to the elk carcass. Close enough I could hear wet breathing inside his chest. One clawed hand rested briefly against the exposed ribs like possessive ownership. Then he looked directly at me. Not at the rifle, at me, measuring, calculating. I felt suddenly certain he knew exactly who I was, how often I stayed in the cabin, which trails I used, where I slept. The rain dripped steadily from his fur while nobody moved. Then, from deeper in the woods, came another sound. A distant voice. Help. Human. Male. Weak. Every muscle in Evelyn's body locked instantly. "No," she whispered under her breath. The voice came again, farther uphill. "Please." I started turning instinctively toward it before Evelyn grabbed my arm hard enough to hurt. "Do not answer." Romulus never reacted to the voice at all. That terrified me more than anything, because it meant he expected it. The creature slowly backed away from the carcass after another long stare at Evelyn, then disappeared uphill into fog without sound. Not fleeing. Leaving. The fake voice stopped immediately afterward. That night, Evelyn drank until nearly sunrise. The cabin smelled like wet wool and bourbon, while rain hammered the roof overhead. She spread old maps across the table beside stacks of field notes I had never seen before. Pages covered in migration patterns and encounter reports stretching back decades. Longer than her project. Longer than official records. Some dated to the 1950s. Others much older. Hunters disappearing near the same valleys repeatedly across generations. Bodies found partially buried. Witnesses describing pairs. Always pairs. I realized then the creatures had never truly been discovered because people kept assuming each incident was isolated folklore. Evelyn tapped one marked location near the Canadian border. "Thomas vanished here," she said quietly. Another point farther south. Idaho team disappeared there. Then she pointed directly at the Bitterroot Valley surrounding the cabin. "They keep returning here." I asked why. She looked toward the dark window. "I think this is where they raise young." The words settled heavily between us. Because suddenly, every strange behavior changed shape entirely. The gifts, the observation, the patience. We were not studying predators. We were living beside a den. Around 3 in the morning, the motion alarm triggered outside. Single perimeter breach. Eastern side. Evelyn muted the lights immediately. We watched the grainy monitor screen together while static flickered across the feed. Snowmelt dripped from the porch roof outside. Wind moved through trees in slow waves. Then Remus appeared on camera. Alone. He approached the porch carrying something carefully in both hands. Not an animal. A backpack, human. Mud stained and torn open along one side. Remus placed it directly before the cabin door, then sat down beside it. Waiting? Evelyn stared at the screen in horror, because she recognized the pack. I could see it immediately on her face. "Whose is it?" I asked. She didn't answer. Remus remained motionless on the monitor. Patient. Almost gentle. Then, softly, barely audible through the external microphone, the creature made a sound. Not a growl, not a howl, a word. Eve. I did not sleep after hearing that voice. Neither did Evelyn. The cabin remained dark until dawn while we sat beside the monitor in complete silence. Outside, Remus eventually disappeared back into the woods, leaving the backpack on the porch exactly where he placed it. Rainwater pooled beneath it overnight. Neither of us touched it until morning. The thing that disturbed me most was not the word itself. It was the tone. Gentle, familiar, like recognition. At first light, Evelyn opened the door cautiously with the rifle pressed against her shoulder. Fog drifted low across the clearing. The valley looked washed pale beneath the rain clouds. No movement anywhere near the tree line, only the backpack. Old forestry issue canvas. Torn straps. Mold beginning around the seams. Evelyn crouched beside it slowly without speaking. Her hands shook before she even opened it. Inside were bones. Human finger bones wrapped carefully in cloth. Nothing else. No blood, no flesh. Just clean bones bundled almost respectfully. I saw Evelyn close her eyes immediately. "Whose pack was it?" I asked again. She swallowed hard before answering. Nolan Pierce, one of the missing Idaho researchers. My stomach turned cold. That backpack had vanished 12 years earlier, which meant one of two things. Either the creatures stored objects intentionally over time, or they understood emotional significance well enough to retrieve specific items later. Both possibilities horrified me equally. Evelyn carried the bones downstairs into the bunker without another word. I heard filing cabinets opening beneath the floor, while rain tapped steadily against the windows overhead. She stayed down there for almost 2 hours. When she returned, she looked older somehow. Exhausted in a permanent way. "I need to show you something," she said quietly. The bunker smelled like dust, diesel fuel, and old paper. Metal shelves lined every wall stacked with field journals, audio reels, specimen containers, and camera archives dating back decades. I had seen the room before, but never the locked cabinet at the rear. Evelyn opened it with a brass key she wore beneath her shirt. Inside sat 6 binders marked with dates. 20 years of observations. This was the real study. Not the sanitized reports sent to agencies. Not the edited wildlife data presented at conferences before she disappeared from academic life. These were personal records, behavioral notes, vocal experiments, territory maps, and pages filled with names. Missing hikers, hunters, researchers. People connected somehow to the creature's movement patterns. I spent hours reading while Evelyn paced the bunker restlessly. The deeper I got, the worse it became. The creatures displayed consistent social behavior across generations, shared hunting territories, rotational den sites, distinct vocalizations assigned to specific individuals, even apparent mourning rituals. One entry described Remus remaining near a dead female for 36 consecutive hours during winter migration. Another documented Romulus returning repeatedly to a ranger station after hearing recorded human speech played there weeks earlier. The most disturbing notes involved mimicry, not simple sound imitation, contextual usage. The creatures repeated phrases connected to emotional responses, fear, comfort, grief. Evelyn theorized they learned the language association similarly to corvids or primates, but with predatory application. Then I found the torn reference, page 147. Missing. Only the torn edge remained inside the binder. I looked up immediately. What was on this page? Evelyn stopped pacing. For several seconds she said nothing. Then she sat across from me heavily. That was the first time one spoke in conversation. Even now, writing those words feels wrong. Conversation implies understanding. The bunker suddenly felt airless around me. Evelyn rubbed both hands together slowly before continuing. 3 years earlier, she had been conducting audio response trials near the southern ridge during heavy snowfall. Remus approached the observation blind alone shortly after dusk. Standard behavior by then. Curious, but cautious. Evelyn spoke aloud routinely during those encounters. Simple phrases, repeated patterns, the same way trainers work with intelligent animals. Good night, stay back. Easy now. Over time, Remus began associating specific sounds with actions. Then, during that storm, while Evelyn packed equipment to leave before dark, she slipped on ice near the ravine edge and fractured her ankle badly enough she could not stand. Night temperatures dropped below zero quickly in those mountains. She screamed once from pain. Remus appeared less than a minute later, not attacking, watching. Evelyn described lying there in snowfall, unable to reach the snowmobile while the creature circled nearby. She believed she would die there. Exposure, blood loss. Maybe worse if Romulus arrived. Then Remus approached within 10 feet for the first time ever. Close enough for her to smell wet fur and carrion breath. Close enough to see frost collecting on the creature's whiskers. Evelyn tried ordering him away repeatedly. Instead, he stared directly at her injured leg, then spoke. 3 words, slow, broken, forced through an inhuman throat. Hurts, Eve. Hurts. I remember feeling physically ill hearing that story. Not because it sounded impossible anymore, because I believed her. The room stayed quiet a long time afterward except for generator hum beneath the floorboards. Finally, I asked the question sitting between us since dawn. Why tear the page out? Evelyn looked toward the cabinet. Because that wasn't the worst part. Before she could continue, the motion alarm sounded upstairs. Single chime, western perimeter. We froze instantly. Evelyn shut the binder closed. No second alarm followed. That bothered her more. 1 breach means observation, she whispered. We climbed upstairs carefully. Afternoon fog had thickened outside the cabin windows until the forest looked drowned in gray smoke. Visibility maybe 20 yards at most. No movement, no sound. Then I noticed the porch. Fresh objects arranged neatly across the boards. 5 stones placed in a straight line. Beside them sat my red winter glove. The same glove Remus returned weeks earlier. Only now the fabric was dark with fresh blood. Evelyn opened the door cautiously while I covered the tree line with the rifle. The stones were warm when she touched them despite the cold air outside. Recently handled. She studied the arrangement silently. Then her expression changed completely. Fear, real fear again. What? I asked. Evelyn looked toward the fog. That's not Remus. A low howl rolled through the valley almost immediately afterward, deep enough to vibrate inside my chest. Farther east, another howl answered, then another. Not random calls, communication. The woods around us suddenly felt populated. Evelyn grabbed my arm hard, inside, now. We barricaded the cabin before sunset. Window shutters locked. Generator lights killed. Rifles loaded beside every entrance. I remember asking how many creatures she believed lived in those mountains. Her answer came too quickly, more than before. That night the sounds began around midnight. Footsteps circling outside the cabin. Slow at first, then closer. Heavy breathing beneath the windows. Scratching against exterior walls. Not attacking, testing. Always testing. At one point, something pressed against the front door hard enough to bow the wood inward slightly. I kept the rifle trained there for nearly an hour while Evelyn listened from the dark. Then came the whistle. 3 short bursts. Closer than before, answered immediately from uphill. Then silence again. Complete silence. Evelyn whispered something I barely heard. They're coordinating. Around 3 in the morning, another sound emerged outside, soft tapping against the porch railing. Rhythmic, almost thoughtful. I moved carefully toward the side window for a better angle, and saw Romulus standing in the fog 20 feet from the cabin, watching us, not hidden, not hunting, waiting. Then slowly, deliberately, he lifted one clawed hand and tapped the porch post 3 times. The exact same rhythm as the whistles from the woods. A signal. And somewhere deep beyond the valley, something answered back. Morning never truly arrived the next day. The storm clouds stayed low over the valley, turning the woods charcoal gray even after sunrise. Rainwater dripped steadily from the pines while fog moved between the trunks in long, slow currents. The cabin smelled like cold coffee, gun oil, and exhaustion. Neither of us spoke much. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table, reviewing old maps while I watched the tree line through binoculars. No movement since dawn. No tracks visible from the porch. If the creatures remained nearby, they were keeping distance intentionally. That worried Evelyn more than aggression ever did. Romulus only shows himself when he wants something understood, she said quietly. I looked toward the porch post where he had tapped the night before. What was he saying? She folded the map carefully before answering. That they're organized. The realization settled ugly in my stomach because I already knew she was right. Random predators do not coordinate signals through miles of forest. They do not leave symbolic arrangements on porches. They do not retrieve decade-old belongings belonging to missing researchers. And they do not speak names. By noon, the rain eased enough for us to inspect the perimeter. Mud sucked at our boots while we moved carefully between the trees surrounding the cabin. Fresh sign appeared everywhere once we started looking properly. Broken branches 6 feet above ground, tracks layered over older tracks, claw marks carved into bark facing inward toward the property. Not territory markers this time. Boundary lines. Something had enclosed us. Evelyn photographed each mark methodically while I scanned the woods with the rifle. The silence around the valley felt deliberate again. No birdsong, no squirrels. Even the wind seemed muffled beneath the fog. Then we found the deer. It hung from a lodgepole pine 50 yards north of the creek crossing. Not eaten, displayed. The carcass had been opened neatly from sternum to pelvis. Organs removed, bones untouched. Mud covered the hind legs where something dragged it uphill before suspending it from the tree using torn strips of bark twisted almost like rope. Human-style problem-solving. Evelyn stared at the scene without moving. "That's new," she whispered. I noticed the symbol carved into the exposed ribcage next. 3 parallel slashes crossing a circle. Not random clawing. Intentional marking. Could they copy symbols, I asked. Evelyn did not answer immediately. Instead, she crouched near the tree base, studying the mud carefully. Then she stood too quickly. "We're leaving." That caught me off guard. Evelyn Mercer had spent 2 decades refusing to abandon that valley. She endured funding cuts, disappearances, government pressure, and complete isolation without retreating once. Seeing genuine panic on her face unsettled me more than the carcass did. Back at the cabin, she moved fast, packing journals, hard drives, audio tapes. The remaining research binders disappeared into waterproof cases while she fueled both snowmobiles despite the thawing trails. I finally grabbed her arm. What changed? She looked directly at me then. The mark. What about it? I've only seen it once before. Her voice dropped lower. Outside, Thomas Avery's tent. The room went cold around me. That symbol meant escalation somehow, not random intimidation. Communication. and Evelyn believed it connected directly to the first disappearance. By late afternoon, we loaded most of the research into my truck. Rain returned in sharp bursts against the roof while thunder rolled somewhere beyond the western ridges. Evelyn kept glancing toward the woods every few minutes, as though expecting interruption. Then she handed me the torn page. First time I had touched it. The paper felt strangely stiff around the claw indentations. Blood staining spread across the bottom margin in dark, rust-colored streaks. Most of the text consisted of field observations written in Evelyn's tight handwriting, until the final paragraph. That section looked rushed, uneven, like she wrote it under stress. I remember every word clearly. Subject Remus displayed responsive comprehension beyond mimicry threshold during the final contact event. Behavioral indicators suggest active concealment of additional population group north of Observation Valley. Subject repeatedly attempted redirection away from juvenile tracks. Romulus exhibited defensive territorial behavior consistent with guarding activity rather than hunting activity. Conclusion revised. Species not transient. Breeding population confirmed. Then one final sentence underlined twice. They are teaching the young to recognize us individually. I looked up slowly. How many are out there? Evelyn shook her head once. I stopped, estimating years ago. Thunder cracked hard enough to rattle the windows. At almost the same moment, the motion alarm triggered upstairs. South perimeter, then east, then north. 3 breaches simultaneously. Evelyn went pale instantly. That's never happened before. Another alarm followed. West perimeter. Every approach route surrounding the cabin. My pulse kicked hard in my throat while Evelyn killed the interior lights automatically. Rain hammered the roof overhead as monitor screens flickered alive across the darkened room. Shapes moved between trees. Fast. Too fast for clear identification. Then one paused directly before the northern camera. Juvenile. Smaller than Remus by nearly half. Thin gray fur plastered wet against narrow shoulders. Eyes enormous in the infrared glare. It tilted its head toward the camera exactly the way Remus always did. Then another shape emerged behind it. Then another. 3 juveniles standing together at the forest edge watching the cabin. Children. God help me. They looked like children learning curiosity. A deep growl rolled through the speakers immediately afterward. Romulus stepped into frame behind them. The juveniles vanished instantly back into the woods. Romulus remained, watching the camera, watching us. Then slowly he opened his mouth. Static crackled violently through the speaker system. The sound warped halfway between canine vocalization and human speech. One word forced itself through. Leave. Every monitor died simultaneously. The cabin dropped into darkness except for lightning flashes through the windows. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then, from outside, came the whistles again. Not one direction this time. All around us. Different distances, different tones. Coordinated movement through the valley. Evelyn loaded ammunition into a shotgun with trembling hands. "They've never warned me before," she whispered. Another whistle sounded directly beside the cabin, too close. I moved toward the side window carefully and saw movement through the rain. Smaller shapes darting between trees near the creek bank. The juveniles, watching, learning. Thunder shook the valley again while heavy footsteps approached slowly from the rear tree line. Not hiding now, deliberate, confident. Romulus emerged from the fog 20 yards behind the cabin carrying something pale in one hand. At first, I thought driftwood. Then lightning flashed. Human bones, a skull dangling from the spinal column. He dropped them carefully beside the woodpile. Gift behavior again, or warning. I could no longer tell the difference. Evelyn suddenly looked exhausted beyond words. Not frightened anymore, just broken somehow. I made them curious, she murmured. The whistles stopped abruptly outside. Complete silence settled over the valley. Then, from somewhere beyond the eastern ridge came a sound I will never forget. Laughter, not human laughter, an imitation of it. Multiple voices trying together. Uneven, wet, wrong. The juveniles practicing us in the dark. The laughter continued for nearly an hour, not constant, not chaotic. Bursts. Short, broken attempts drifting through the trees beyond the cabin like children repeating sounds they barely understood. Some almost convincing. Others twisted halfway into growls. Every few minutes, one voice would stop abruptly while another picked up farther away, as though they were practicing from different positions around the valley. Evelyn sat motionless beside the dead monitor screens, listening to it. I kept the rifle aimed toward the rear windows until my shoulders cramped. Neither of us spoke because there was nothing useful left to say. By dawn, the sounds had vanished completely. Rain still fell lightly over the valley, turning the clearing outside into black mud. Fog clung low against the tree line. The bones Romulus left beside the woodpile remained exactly where he dropped them. Human vertebrae connected to half a rib cage. Old. Weathered clean. Evelyn stared at them from the porch without approaching. "That's Thomas," she whispered. I looked at her sharply. "You're sure?" She nodded slowly. The fracture on the clavicle. Climbing accident during the first survey season. For 20 years, she told herself Thomas Avery might still be alive somewhere beyond those mountains. I understood that now. The denial was easier than accepting what coexistence with these things truly cost. But Romulus had ended that fantasy deliberately. Not because he hated her, because he wanted her to understand something. The realization hit me while we buried the bones near the creek under steady drizzle. Romulus never acted randomly. Every appearance carried intent. Every object placed around the cabin communicated information, and this message was clear. The past was over. Evelyn dug the grave herself despite her arthritis. Wet soil packed beneath her fingernails while ravens circled overhead through the fog. Neither of us spoke much during the burial. At one point she stopped digging and looked toward the woods. "I used to think Remus pitied us," she said quietly. "What changed?" She wiped mud from her hands slowly. "I think he envied us." That sentence stayed with me all day. Back inside the cabin, Evelyn finally explained what happened before the page was torn from her report. The final observation period. The event that convinced her to destroy 20 years of research. 3 months earlier, she discovered juvenile tracks north of the shale ridge. Small prints traveling alongside adult movement patterns. At first, she assumed temporary migration overlap. Then she found nesting sites. Not dens. Nests. Branches woven together beneath rock overhangs. Animal pelts layered for insulation. Bone fragments arranged in circular patterns around sleeping areas. Evidence of long-term habitation. Family structures. Evelyn realized then the species was not surviving by accident. They were raising generations successfully in complete secrecy across wilderness corridors stretching through multiple states and provinces. A stable, hidden population. And the juveniles were learning behavior through observation. Human behavior. That was why Remus kept approaching the cabin over the years. Why objects disappeared from campsites. Why the creatures listened outside windows during conversations. Study. The same thing Evelyn thought she was doing to them. "I crossed a line somewhere," she admitted quietly. I stopped observing and started teaching. Outside, wind moved through the trees with a low, hollow sound. The cabin suddenly felt less like shelter and more like intrusion. Late that afternoon, we prepared to leave the valley before nightfall. Research crates loaded, fuel packed, weapons checked twice. Evelyn moved through the cabin gathering only essentials now. No attachment left in her movements. 20 years reduced to evacuation. Then she stopped beside the porch door. There's one thing missing. I knew immediately what she meant. The audio archives, dozens of reels stored in a secondary cache north of the ridge, vocal recordings collected across years of encounters. Evelyn refused to leave them behind. I argued hard against going after them, harder than I had argued anything in years. The weather was turning worse again, fog thickening, light fading early behind storm clouds, and after the previous night every instinct I had screamed the valley wanted us gone. Evelyn listened quietly, then said something that ended the argument immediately. If those recordings survive, someone else comes looking. She was right. So we went. The trail north climbed steep through soaked timberland where moss covered nearly every surface. Mud sucked at our boots while rainwater dripped steadily from pine branches overhead. The woods carried that same unnatural silence again. No wildlife sounds anywhere. Only our footsteps, and occasionally distant movement deeper between the trees matching our pace. The cache sat hidden beneath an abandoned ranger shelter nearly 2 miles from the cabin, half collapsed from snow damage. Rusted stovepipe hanging crooked through the roof. Evelyn retrieved the audio cases quickly while I scanned the surrounding forest with growing dread. That was when we found the tracks. Juvenile prints everywhere around the shelter. Small, fresh, dozens of them. Evelyn crouched slowly beside one set and pressed deeply into wet soil. I watched her expression change from concentration to horror almost instantly. Mixed among the tracks were boot prints, human, child-sized. The rain suddenly felt colder against my skin. "Tell me those are old," I said quietly. Evelyn did not answer. She followed the tracks behind the shelter instead. I stayed close with the rifle raised while fog drifted thick between the trees around us. 20 yards behind the structure we found the effigy. Animal bones wired together with strips of bark hanging from a pine branch at eye level. Deer skull at the center. Human clothing woven through the ribs. Small stones placed carefully beneath it in a circle. And tied around the neck of the thing was a photograph, one of Evelyn's old field pictures. Her standing beside Remus near the creek 15 years earlier. Someone had punctured holes through her eyes. A deep growl echoed somewhere nearby almost immediately afterward. Close. Too close. I turned toward the sound and caught movement through the fog uphill. Juveniles. 3 of them watching from between the trees. Smaller than adults, but unmistakably the same species. Lean bodies, long arms. Wet gray fur clinging dark against narrow shoulders. Their eyes reflected pale gold through the mist. Curious. Not afraid. One tilted its head exactly like Remus always did. Then another opened its mouth slightly, and in a childlike broken voice it whispered, "Dale." Everything inside me went cold. The creature smiled immediately after saying it, not an animal expression, an imitation of one. Learned behavior copied imperfectly from observation. Then all 3 vanished into the fog at once as heavy footsteps crashed somewhere deeper uphill behind them. Romulus. Coming fast. Evelyn grabbed my sleeve hard. "Run!" We ran downhill through rain and fog so thick the trees looked like shadows sliding beside us. Branches whipped across my face while mud collapsed beneath our boots on the slope. Somewhere uphill, Romulus crashed through the timber behind us with terrifying speed. not sprinting blindly, tracking, deliberate. Every few seconds the whistles sounded again, farther through the woods, signals moving ahead of us, coordinating positions. The juveniles were driving us somewhere. That realization hit me halfway down the ridge. Not hunting. Herding. Evelyn understood it too. I could hear it in her breathing, fast but controlled. She kept glancing toward the eastern ravine instead of the trail back to the cabin, because she knew what lay there. The den sites. "Don't let them split us," she shouted over the wind. Then a shape burst across the trail 20 yards ahead. One of the juveniles, small compared to Romulus, but still larger than any wolf alive. It landed on all fours briefly before rising upright again near the creek bank. Watching us, learning us. The creature opened its mouth and produced a rough imitation of laughter, that same broken sound from the night before. Then it disappeared into brush as Romulus roared somewhere behind us. Not a wolf howl, not bare vocalization, something deeper, angrier. The sound shook through my chest hard enough to stop rational thought completely. We reached the lower creek crossing just before dusk. Water surged waist-deep from snowmelt, carrying broken branches through the current. The cabin sat another half-mile south beyond dense timber. Too far, especially with something pacing us through the fog. Evelyn suddenly stopped moving. I nearly collided into her. "What are you doing?" She stared toward the ridge behind us where dark shapes moved faintly between trees. Then she looked at me with exhausted certainty. "They're not after both of us." Rain streamed down her face while she pulled the torn report page from inside her coat. "They want this." I realized then what she intended immediately. "No. Dale. No." Her voice softened for the first time in days. "You know I'm right." I hated her in that moment for sounding calm. The whistles shifted again through the forest. Closer now, different directions, encircling. Evelyn pressed the page into my hand. "Take the truck south, burn everything else." "And you?" She looked toward the woods. "I started this." Another growl rolled through the valley. Closer. I grabbed her arm hard. "We leave together." Then movement appeared across the creek. Remus, standing motionless in the rain beneath a leaning cedar tree. Not aggressive, watching Evelyn. God help me, there was sadness in him. Real sadness. The same look a dog gives before a storm. Evelyn stepped slowly toward the water's edge despite my protests. "Easy," she whispered. Remus tilted his head once, then looked uphill behind us. Warning. At almost the same instant, Romulus exploded from the fog 30 yards back. Massive, furious, mud spraying beneath clawed feet as he charged downhill through the trees. The juveniles scattered instantly from his path. I raised the rifle and fired twice. The shots echoed through the valley. Romulus barely slowed. One round hit the shoulder. I saw fur burst dark with blood. Still, he kept coming with horrifying speed. Then Remus moved. He intercepted Romulus mid-charge beside the creek bank. The impact sounded like two elk colliding head-on. Both creatures crashed through brush, snarling violently. Teeth flashing. Mud and rainwater spraying everywhere. Romulus towered over the leaner creature, but Remus fought with desperate intensity. Not dominance, protection. Evelyn screamed his name. That was the first time I ever heard genuine emotion in her voice around them. The fight lasted seconds. Romulus slammed Remus against a boulder hard enough to crack bone audibly. The smaller creature collapsed into the creek water with a choking cry. Then Romulus turned toward us again, those pale eyes fixed directly on Evelyn, and stopped, because Evelyn had dropped the torn page into the water. The current carried it immediately downstream between rocks and foam. For the first time since I met the creature, Romulus hesitated. Not confusion, calculation. Evelyn understood before I did. The page mattered because it identified the juveniles. Proof of breeding populations. Proof they existed in organized family groups. Proof humanity would come hunting if the research survived. Romulus stared after the drifting paper, while rain hammered the creek around us. Then slowly he looked back at Evelyn. No rage left, only recognition. Evelyn stepped forward carefully into the water. "You protected them," she whispered. Romulus remained perfectly still. I realized suddenly that every escalation over the past days centered around the juveniles, the warnings, the symbols, the coordinated pressure driving us from the valley. Not predatory behavior, parental behavior. We were the threat. The truth landed like a stone in my chest because it reframed 20 years instantly. Evelyn believed she was protecting a hidden species from discovery. Romulus believed he was protecting his family from Evelyn. Neither side was entirely wrong. Remus lifted his head weakly from the creek behind them, blood mixed with rainwater around his jaw. He looked toward Evelyn one final time. Then, in that broken near-human voice, he forced out 2 words. "Go. Eve." Romulus turned immediately at the sound. Not anger, alarm. The juveniles had appeared again uphill watching from the fog line. 3 small shapes standing close together beneath the trees. Watching their elders. Learning. Always learning. Romulus backed slowly toward them without taking his eyes off us. One of the juveniles copied the motion exactly a second later. Mimicry again. Teaching behavior. Then the entire group disappeared into the forest together. Silent within seconds. Only Remus remained behind. Evelyn moved toward him immediately. I caught her shoulder. "That thing will kill you." "No," she said quietly. "Not him." The creature lay half-submerged against the creek bank, breathing wetly through shattered ribs. Up close, he looked older than before. Scars hidden beneath fur. Cloudiness beginning around one eye. Evelyn knelt beside him in the rain. 20 years of obsession and fear reduced suddenly to grief. Remus watched her carefully while blood spread through the current around his body. Then slowly, he pushed something toward her with one clawed hand. A cassette tape. Old, mud-stained. Wrapped carefully in cloth. Evelyn stared at it in disbelief. "The Idaho recording," she whispered. "The missing original archive. Remus had kept it all those years, not stolen, preserved." The creature's breathing slowed heavily. Evelyn touched his shoulder gently. And for one impossible moment Remus leaned into her hand like a dying dog seeking comfort. Then his eyes shifted toward the trees behind us. Listening. A low, distant howl echoed through the valley. Romulus calling. Remus tried to rise immediately despite the injuries. Failed once. Tried again. Evelyn stepped back slowly. The creature managed to stand on shaking legs before looking at her one final time. Then he disappeared, limping into the fog toward his family. We never saw him again. We left the valley before sunrise. Rain still fell across the mountains, washing tracks from the mud behind the truck, while fog swallowed the cabin slowly in the rearview mirror. Evelyn never looked back at it once. 20 years of work abandoned in silence. The cassette tape rested between us on the dashboard wrapped in damp cloth. Neither of us wanted to play it. Not yet. By noon, we reached an old fire lookout station south of Missoula, where Evelyn kept emergency fuel and supplies hidden beneath the floorboards. The tower overlooked miles of black pine forest fading into storm clouds. Safe distance at last. Or what passed for safety after everything we had seen. Evelyn burned most of the remaining research that afternoon inside a rusted oil drum behind the tower. field journals, trackcasts, photographs, entire decades turning to ash beneath cold mountain wind. I remember watching one picture curl black at the edges before disappearing completely. Evelyn, standing beside the creek years younger, while two pale eyes reflected from trees behind her. She never hesitated feeding it to the fire. Only the torn page survived. And the tape. Near dusk, we finally listened to the recording together. Static filled the first minute. Wind, camp noise, nervous laughter from the Idaho survey team. Then the howling began somewhere beyond their tents. Wrong. Human underneath it somehow. A man's voice answered nervously. "Who's out there?" Silence followed. Then another voice spoke from the woods. Perfectly clear. Nolan. Not imitation anymore. Recognition. The tape erupted into panic immediately afterward. Gunshots, screaming. Something massive moving through camp. Then one final sound before the recording ended. Children laughing. Small voices. Multiple. Evelyn shut the recorder off with shaking hands. Neither of us spoke for a very long time. The sun disappeared behind the mountains while darkness spread across the forest below the tower. Somewhere out there, Romulus still moved through those wilderness corridors with the surviving juveniles, teaching them routes, boundaries, human names, teaching them caution. Evelyn finally broke the silence near midnight. "I thought discovery would protect them," she said quietly. "But people only protect things they can control first." The wind carried distant howling through the trees below, not close, not threatening, just present. Evelyn stared into the darkness, listening to it. Then she placed the torn report page into my hands one final time. "I kept that page because it proved they could learn us," she whispered. "I should have realized sooner we were teaching them to fear us, too." Evelyn Mercer died 11 months later in a hospice room outside Bozeman, while late winter snow drifted against the windows. Cancer. Aggressive and fast. By the end, she weighed barely 100 pounds and slept most afternoons beneath the sound of oxygen machines. But even then, she kept the curtains closed after dark. Always. Always. One night, near the end, she asked me to bring the torn page from the motel safe, where I had hidden it since leaving the valley. The paper looked older somehow by then, brittle around the edges, bloodstains dark as rust beneath the lamplight. Evelyn held it carefully in both hands while snow tapped softly against the glass. "You know why I really tore it out?" she asked. "I thought I did. I was wrong." She smiled weakly at my silence. "It wasn't because the government would hunt them." Her breathing rattled painfully for a moment before she continued. "It was because of what came after." She handed me the page again and pointed toward the final paragraph beneath her notes about the juveniles. At first, I thought the ink marks below were water damage. Then I realized they were fingerprints. Small fingerprints, pressed into the paper in mud, child-sized. My stomach turned cold instantly. "I found those after the den survey," Evelyn whispered. "They touched the page while I was writing." I stared at the marks, unable to speak. Not paw prints, fingerprints. The room suddenly felt airless around me. Evelyn leaned back slowly against the pillows. "Remus wasn't bringing gifts because he was tame," she said. "He was trying to understand why humans keep memories in objects." Outside, the hospice wind howled faintly through the parking lot lights. For a second, it sounded almost like those mountain valleys again. Heavy woods, rain, silence between trees. "I spent 20 years believing I was studying predators," she murmured. "But predators don't preserve bones. They don't teach names to their young. They don't warn trespassers away before attacking." She closed her eyes briefly. They were protecting a family. That was the truth she discovered too late. the truth buried beneath all the fear and obsession and missing people. Romulus never escalated until the juveniles were threatened. Every warning had been measured, every display controlled. Even Thomas Avery, God help me, might not have died from hunting instinct alone. He crossed into nesting territory during the winter birthing season. Humans call anything monstrous when it refuses to let us inside its world. Evelyn died 2 days later before sunrise. I buried the torn page with her exactly as she asked. Not because the world would not believe the story, because it would. And somewhere north in those mountains, beyond the valleys where the fog settles heavy between the trees, something is still teaching its young, which humans never learned how to leave wilderness alone.